it, was that a huge part of like getting to Ayuktha's voice, I think there were a few things happening. One was that I was thinking a lot about positionality in history. So I was thinking a lot about the vantage point of being in a contemporary politic, looking back at a history at particular political moments, and being able to see the consequences of them almost ahead of time, right? What would happen if something that was so beautiful or something that was so awe-inspiring also had negative consequences? Like, how would you deal with that if you could not see it if you were only based in 1974? Like, you could only know the possibility of, say, the ways that a really successful moment might lead to a really negative consequence. And the only way to do that was to have someone who is based in the modern day. But that wasn't, I think, the only thing that was on my mind. I think I was also curious about, right, like writing from particularly a positionality that matched my own. I was interested in writing from a caste-privileged, relatively class-privileged, Gujarati, Hindu-raised standpoint. And so also that, to me, I think was necessary for finding Ayuktha, somebody who would like be able to criticize and also problematize her own positionality. And so that was, I think, also incredibly important to me. And then I think the final aspect is that I never even knew when I started writing who Ayuktha would be. I thought I was writing from the voice of ancestral memory, and this is something that became incredibly problematic. I'm looking at like folks from work. Like, it's one of those things that was like actually really hard, because then by the time I got to the point of thinking about how I could problematize something, what happens when you're actually not grounded in any history? If things don't matter to you today, how could you possibly see the consequences for their importance? And so Ayuktha became necessary in that way for me. She became the only way that I could possibly tell this story. And so I think originally where she was just maybe the third protagonist, she became the narrator. Yeah.
That's such an interesting shift, which we'll come back to a little bit later. So the family inheritance, to which I'm so like kind of, I'm trying to not spoil things, but also there are magnificent objects and just beautiful things that Asha has invented in this, and one of them is a tapestry that is really key to the plot, and if you inherit it, it kind of connects to the owner's artistic ability and powers to manifest things that they might want, and sometimes in ways that, like any good fictional magical object, it doesn't always, its rules are not always clear, it doesn't always obey, and you're kind of like, I don't know how this thing works, what do I do? And I wonder if you could just tell us about the tapestry, how you ended up inventing that as the particular object of mystery and power, and about inventing rules such as they are.
Totally. Anyone who has been in a place I have lived in knows that I have tapestries kind of like everywhere. They're like the thing that I have gotten from my parents. And they're not really entirely sure where they got them to, right? Like, it's, this one was hand painted and we picked it up like back in 1999, or this one belonged to your grandmother, or this one belonged to so-and-so. And so I actually see tapestries, it's almost hilarious because I think this is a little bit a product of writing this book during the pandemic and having to think about, you know, I think my subconscious was looking at sources of inspiration that were immediately around me, and it turns out that I happen to have an apartment that is full of tapestries. So lo and behold, that ended up in the book. But it was also one of those things, I think, where one of the key parts of this tapestry was that I never quite pictured it fully for myself. But I did have a very strict set of rules. And I think you and I worked on this together. What are if there are 3 rules, what could they be? Julie, also, we worked on this together. I think this was like the great battle of like, what are the powers that this thing could hold and like what would make it possible? And without giving a spoiler, I think one of my favorite moments in the book is also, right, like trying to break the rule, like wanting so badly to be able to break the rules of this tapestry. But I think what it ends up doing is like unlocking power for characters, right, in a way that like they may not have access to in their daily lives, or may not be bequeathed to them by institutions. And it's like this simple object, and maybe also to tie it back to Ayuktha, like it's an everyday object, much as oral storytelling is an everyday object, right? Like those are everyday ways of doing things, and so they felt like they could be contained by these characters and be utilized in ways that like were so, I don't know, like there were so many multitudes of ways that like a tapestry might exist for a family. Yeah.
Can you give us one example of how the tapestry works in the plot or the story?
Oh, yeah. So one of the things is that you have to be sewn upon it. And so that as like a physical act done by someone for a child. And so that is a way that one of our protagonists knows early on, though, the length of time a parent suffered, or the length of time a parent was near death, is that like it had to physically happen. And so that, I think, in a way was like, that's a rule, is you have to be on it to unlock this power, or you have to really be in a type of meditative state to unlock the power, which I think is like a hard lesson learned for a couple of the characters.
And the power is gendered.
Ooh, but it's not. No, no. They have this conversation. So our narrator has this conversation with her wife that is like, historically, it has been gendered as a way to talk about whether or not the people who have the most power should be the ones who have access to this power. But in fact, it ends up being that the narrator is talking more in a way of, you know, we don't live in the same power exact dynamics that had faced, say, a great-grandparent. And so what happens in a world where we can actually unlock and think bigger about it? So yeah, while it is historically gendered, it's very explicit for the characters that this is actually not, there's no gender essentialism to the way that this tapestry is passed on. And I think that was actually like a really important part of thinking about how magic worked. And like, actually for me, I think problematizing the way that magic sometimes works in books, which is like, oh, women have this. And it's like, okay, hold on. What are your politics? Like, can you say more? Yeah.
So we're talking a little bit about the history, which we'll get back to again later, but in relation to some of the things you're talking about relating to privilege, you wrote in a recent essay published in LitHub, which you may be interested in reading in its entirety, you wrote that I wanted the gift to feel like an undeserved privilege for them to see it as something they shouldn't use. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think one of the critical components here is that I gave our main character's family the exact migration pattern of my own family, which is to say that I was interested in a positionality that I understood innately, or at least really well, you know? Let's not say innately, let's say, oh, I knew it. And so what I was interested in was also exploring, like, what does it mean? I think it's like really exciting to think about what it means to have power when you don't always have power. But I also think that power is an insidious and tempting and seductive thing. And I think that often when you have relative power, then even more power is even more seductive. And I think what I wanted to think about was, if you have this ability to change something, do you also believe that you, one, have the right knowledge, and do you have the knowledge of the right path forward for everyone? Like, you might know what you need next, but do you know what everyone needs next? And like, we see power backfire, we see power succeed. Like, I think we see many ways in which this is manifested in the book. I'm trying to not give away any spoilers.
And the world.
I'm trying so hard. Yeah, and in the world. And so I think it's also like, yeah, how do you decide that you are the right person for the job? And how do you believe that you deserve the job? Like, I think that that's like, so how do you believe that you deserve power? And so that to me became a central moment of the book. It's like, how do we strip away? And so there's a character who actually denies herself this power later. And I think it's important that we like look at those things side by side, in terms of thinking about like, not only just like, let's take power one way versus what does organizing and movement work do? Those things are placed in like flush contrast to each other. And so I think that was like an important way for me to understand that, like, that problematizing, or that's what that sentence in that one essay kind of hints toward.
So the tapestry is a significant object in the book, but it's not by any stretch the only one. I am very fond of a teakwood box that appears, and there's a passage about that, and I wonder if you would read that.
I do, and in the funniest ways of objects, when I put my material objects down as I walked on the stage, I left my material book over there, so give me one moment. I knew this was coming. I was like, oh no, what have I done? Okay, beautiful. It's like, oh, it's already dog-eared. I must return. Yes, I can read that passage. There is nothing to do but open the teakwood box. Here, a memory of justice. Here, a memory of revenge. Here, a memory and a memory and a memory, ridges along a spine. But Amla, breathing deep, pushes them all aside, She doesn't want to be told how others navigated this in the past. Those stories already live deep in the recesses of her own body. Now, she's thinking only of the way the Bon stained Sharma's teeth as he watched Bahar at the harmonium. His hungry eyes, the placement of girl onto menu. She doesn't have to understand exactly what happened. She doesn't have to have words for it to know it. She knows. She knows. Amla considers every secret, every promise, and begins to paint until it is no longer night and she remembers only the blur of her thrujva across the page. She paints, even as Bapu peeks into the room to check whether she has slept. She waves him away, back to his vigil. There is no need for a chaperone. She has already made a decision. Is this the gift that the tapestry gives her? The ability to do something when she can do nothing else, to channel this energy somewhere? I hold myself still, memory coursing through blood. This is a history I want to change, and cannot. When I'm alone, when I'm wondering what all of this means, I sit with these memories first. Who holds the blame? Amla for her impulsivity, or her mother for never explaining to her how this all works? How does anyone ever learn the rules of this ancestry? But no matter what questions I ask, what is already being done cannot be undone. The images she sets in motion with every frustrated gesture of an 11-year-old's hand. The perimeter of the painting is a deep mahogany, framing a formal head-on image of Mahesh Shankar Sharma. A wreath of marigolds droops down from the upper left corner of the frame and curves to the upper right. It is a tradition, reserved only for the already dead. As the painting dries on the floor beside Babu's cot, the newspapers announce the Mountbatten Plan, the partitioning of Hindustan into 2 independent dominions. Cities in the morning will begin to trickle, then to flow and erupt red. Weren't they already, you might wonder? But this entire night is the door that locks behind us. You must understand, this is the terror my mother woke from, crying, that I will wake from, crying, and that my daughter will wake from, crying, and my granddaughter too will remember it crying. She will, and oh, I will carry it from one to the next to the other, this earth I bear upon my back.
Thank you so much. That's one of my favorite passages in the book. So Ayukta, in speaking to her wife, Nadia, is recalling generations of her family and how this tapestry has passed from one person to the other. And as you have mentioned, historically, it passes from woman to woman. And Amla, who is right at the historical hinge of partition, experiences it as a particular moment of violence, and also experiences her own uncomfortable agency in relation to her art, which sometimes makes things happen in a way she's not totally ready for. So Amla's story goes back to partition, which is 1947, and it leads to the formation of India and Pakistan, and that's the reference at the end of the passage you just read. And what kind of research did you do to write about partition? And it's sort of like it's the sort of moment that many people think they know a lot about, and you bring a great and beautiful freshness to that moment. And I wonder if you could just talk about writing about partition.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that I ended up coming back to this plot, or coming to this book, was that during my first semester of the MFA, my grandmother had passed away, and that was my last grandparent to remember partition. But I had spent years interviewing her. When I was an undergrad, I had a professor who was a priest who essentially gave us the task of going and asking folks in 1960 what they were up to, right? And it was kind of like an indicting exercise, which was really great. But for me, that was like an exercise to go back to my own grandmother and ask her, hey, never mind 1960, like let's also do that, but also let's go back even further. And what do you know? And so I was on a 3-way call with my grandmother and my mother, because my Gujarati is not that great. And so I was able to have that conversation with all 3 of us together. And then that continued. I was taking voice notes of like a lot of conversations that I was having with elders. That included my grandfather's older brother. It included every time I went back to India, so 2017, 2019, 2022, just like understand those moments. And those are just jumping off moments, but they also help me, think about what journey matched this positionality, this relative experience of partition. And so my grandfather had taken a steamboat when he was 15 years old from Karachi to Gujarat, and that is something that appears within the first 3 chapters of this novel, is a steamboat ride from Karachi to Gujarat. But then, like, shout out to the University of Minnesota South Asian Library, right, and specifically the librarians who work there, who do so much and know so much, and also like the South Asian Digital Archive, which is like an oral storytelling project of folks who experienced partition, and their recordings of their narratives and their histories are digitized, because this is a generation we are losing. And so I could sit and go through, and they're grouped by, folks' relative experiences by region, by religion, by language, by caste, by class, and you can understand a little bit more and more of all these different stories. And that, paired with JSTOR, is an incredible resource, And so I also ended up spending a lot of time reading and watching movies from, and short stories, and reading short stories from, and around that time to also supplement a lot of that. But to me, I was also just really captured by Sindh is like a specific region and place where Sindh's violence hits in January 1948, not necessarily prior. And that is a story of like relative peace and like a very like mixed port city where a lot of different people live doing a lot of different types of work, and that's where my grandfather grew up, and that was the place that I wanted to start this story from. And so for me, it came back to like every time I heard a story from like a grandparent or a grandparent sibling, that I used that as a place to go to JSTOR and dive a little bit deeper. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And you also took a class.
I did.
Let's remember that right now.
Yes, with Nida Sajid, I did a directed readings course, and directed readings is almost like a false word, because we watched a lot of movies too, and we like listened to a lot of songs. Like it was a very like audio visual. It was worth it. Yeah, directed reading, directed medium. Medium experience, mixed modal experience, multimodal experience. There it is, you get there. That was what it was. And so, yeah, with Nida and Shruti Narayanan, who's another writer who was also in the MFA, we took this directed readings course and were able to like go all the way from short stories that were prior, all the way through to like the Bombay Marxists, like all the way forward, and kind of experiencing this like retrospective of like how this moment became such a cornerstone of the relative hive mind. And say like there were so many different ways in, which way in was most interesting to me, or felt also authenticity, but like felt right or authentic to me. Yeah.
Since you mentioned authenticity, you have written about your relationship to the idea of authenticity in the aforementioned Lit Hub essay, which I highly recommend to you. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit about there's this, of course, like the wide authenticity discourse, the dominant authenticity discourse, and you kind of took a different approach in thinking about what authenticity meant to you specifically. Can you say a little bit about that? Because of course, as a diasporic writer, there's again positionality and the complexity of writing about this history, doing this research, going down into the South Asia Library, which is in a basement, and yeah, can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, I think one, it's important to think about, let me just say that like Suki is also quoted in this Lit Hub essay, which is like a great reason to read it and your work too.
That's not the good part.
But also that I think like, and we discussed this, is that like when I first came across like that boundary of authenticity, I was so shocked. I was so shocked that like that was something that anyone was willing to say. I think that I'd wrested through that. Like I thought I'd wrestled my way through that already, in terms of my own like understanding of identity or whatever. Like I hadn't thought about the way that like worked in the canon. And then I think that like one of the big things to me was to make a craft. Like if I was going to be confounded by this thing, if I was going to be confronted by it, then I also wanted to just make it an exercise that I could like work my way through, like a rock climbing problem, like just like how do I solve this now? And so for me it was interesting in trying to think about what I did not want to do. And so part of that was being interested in, like for example, I'm a really nostalgic person. I'm a very sentimental girly. And so then the question though of like, how do you avoid nostalgia when it is like a hegemonic project, right? Like when nostalgia is a way of saying, let's relive this moment over and over. Let's use it actually to create national identity. Let's use it to create diasporic cultural identity. How could I avoid doing that when like I also already know that the way that I also write nonfiction is to nostalgize? And so part of that was like, I'm gonna only do nostalgia when it intersects with grief. That way, it lives in a place of what is lost, and it also says, look what we have now, is it actually better? And so that to me was like an interesting way to like combat what is already to me like my own instinct towards nostalgia. I also was interested in that question of, you know, do we feel like there are things that people are interested in, or do we feel like there are things that people are interested in? Is that like the Western story, or the you know, there was no coming out story in this book. I was on craft, like as a principle to myself, I did not want to see a coming out story on the pages of this novel. And so that was possibly around my own authentic experience, but it was also, I think about, well, if you're going to tell me that there are things the ways that things should be, let me not even give it to you. And like, let me tell you that like this too can be true. And maybe we can use like these experiences to think about like a collective grief for like what should have been. And not necessarily like maybe this is the way it's always supposed to be. So yeah, whether that's like the Americanizing project, or whether that's about like push and pull fights between kids and their parents. I didn't want those fights to be reduced. I wanted them to be about things that were way bigger than us. And thus like real, like it's so much more real, I think, than anything that you would otherwise see.
And that I think is one of the things that's so beautiful about the book, and that, I mean, in other hands, like these pieces of history have been fodder for propaganda. And here they turn into really the opposite, like a disruption of that kind of storytelling, which I really appreciate. And so there is this focus on partition with Amla's generation. You heard Amla mentioned in that passage. And then you go forward to other time periods that are less frequently written about. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because you write about the rise of Marxist politics in India, India's Green Revolution, student movements, and some of your characters are participating in this. I love reading about activist characters. And I mean, that section, that's like a third of the book. So can you say a little bit about writing in that terrain?
Yeah, I think learning about and then getting to write about the 1974 and No Nirman Andalan was one of the most exciting parts of drafting this novel. And I think part of that was it's so specific to Gujarati history, but it has ramifications for the entirety of India, of the nation. And so these student movements in 1974 are happening because there's a commodity shortage, and because, you know, basic goods are not being able to be afforded. Folks are feeling like the party that won them partition, which is the Congress Party, has failed them in terms of like their daily economics. And the way that I came across it first is that folks said it was the only successful student movement in India. By which they meant, right, by success what they meant was it was the only student movement to fully oust the state government, which is incredible, like as a fact. That's like kind of wild, and then it leads to all these, and you're like,
We need to level up.
Yeah, and so like fully ousts like the Gujarat state government, like all these assemblymen resign, and it leads to a corresponding student movement that takes place in Bihar. And more people know of that one because when J.P. Narayan led it, it goes specifically, that's when Indira Gandhi decides we need to shut this down. The 1975 emergency happens, which is like an incredibly dark moment in Indian history. But its seeds were these plays happening. And so for me, I got to go through and find, so they had these nataks, these plays, like traveling from town to town, that were used as tools to get people on board with the role of government. They had these incredible zines and murals and, you know, this like incredible student pieces of art that were also serving as knowledge sharing and yeah, like good propaganda. Like it's awesome. And you have all of that stuff being passed around, and then getting to play with having a character who was an artist, who was 15 years old and coming into her political own was, I don't know, I thought that was just like a delicious luxury to like get to sit in, because I get to go through her learning of like what is happening. And so yeah, I spent a lot of time talking to folks who were in college in Ahmedabad at that time, going through these like literal objects from history, the zines, the murals, like even what's written about these natex, which is also interesting because that's a play that then is transposed into a written history, and then I'm trying to talk about fictionalizing it. But all of those moments I think were so fun for me to learn about, but then also to get to share.
What parts of that history were most surprising to you? Did you hear about this history growing up?
No, but you know what is I think actually most important is that for something so successful, and I think this is where like the feeling of like what does collective grief for a future look like, is that something so successful that ousts the state government, when that happens, when Congress Party loses its footing in Gujarat, that's when the BJP gets their foothold.
And for those in the audience who might not know who the BJP are, can you?
Yeah, they are the current ruling party. Well, they're now a coalition ruling party, but they're the ruling party of India. Modi is the party leader, but he is also the person who was chief minister of Gujarat back in 2002, when there were pogroms of Muslim Gujaratis by Hindu Gujaratis. And that was, that is like a core part of Gujarati history. And so the BJP's roots are also in Gujarat. And so it's a really damning history, and it's a really important history to talk about, yeah.
And you sort of made a glancing reference there to recent Indian elections, in which the BJP lost some power.
Yeah, still a coalition ruling power. But yes, lost some power, which is fully to the credit of folks who mobilize and folks for whom like it was, like their lives are at stake around mobilizing. Muslim folks, Dalit folks, Adivasi folks, yeah.
Right, so this novel also has an incredibly interesting relationship to current events. So we've got Ayukta, who's telling the story to her wife. She rewinds to Amla, who's kind of in partition and after. And then what is the name of the character who is doing, or what, Tad, do you want to tell us about some of the characters engaged in this zine making, mural painting?
Yeah, one of them is Arnie, who is about 14 or 15 years old, or she like turns 15 during her section, and so she is, she's like coming into her political own during that time. And she's wrestling with the roles of her older brother, she's wrestling with the roles of her mother, folks who, she knows how they voted, and she knows how they act, and she's trying to understand how she wants to vote, or how she would act when given a chance to. And so she's kind of coming into that stage of her own. And then our final section of the book is Ayukta's story. And so she is in the US, and she is an adult in 2002 during this really critical part of Gujarati and Gujarati American history. And she brings us all the way to contemporary Brooklyn, so 2018.
So this book has so many parts that fit together gorgeously. How did the project transform between its first draft and this version that you hold in your hands?
Yeah, the fun part is that I think the first draft of this book was like 4 pages and written at Kenyon Review Writers Workshop in 2018, when I spent all the PTO for my job to go to a writers workshop as a test for whether or not I think I could handle an MFA. And it was an incredibly generative workshop where it was, you write a story a day and then you workshop it the next day. So my personal capacity to write anything more than 5 pages was like 0. Like it had to be maximum 5 pages. And so I wrote a story that was 4 pages long and it felt like ethereal narration, right? Like, there was a woman once who did this, and her granddaughter, and it just like could not sustain any of the politics that I was interested in it sustaining. But it felt like fun, compact, and I put it back in a drawer and waited until I was in an MFA and thought I was working on a different project, and then I was like, lo and behold, I guess this is it. And then that version grew into a version that was told by the voice of ancestral memory, where there was, there was 3 exact sections, and it was told in a collective plural, a we voice that was also hard to sustain, because I could not ground her politics if she could see fully backwards and forward. And that became difficult to manage for my own ability to sleep at night, And so then she became bodied, And then, you know, I should also say that because I am a math brain, kind of like obsessive about like what happens when you get to the end of the draft, that I was like, I'm gonna write this book as a 3-act where every act has 3 acts. And so I had like structured in my mind, I don't know if we talked about this. Like, it's like, I was like, you know, it's gonna be 27 chapters because that's 9 times 3, and like it's gonna work out that way. That's not how it is at all, and that's not, you know, it was like a great idea in my head for when I was like working towards it. And so of course, as it changed over time, that was also something that I had to just like cede control of, was, you know, moving even into the Princess Bride setup where Ayuktha's like coming in every now and then and say like, hey, let's chat about that. You know, that's like a fun, we have this return of Ayuktha and her wife Nadia throughout the novel. And so we kind of like, we have these moments that are big on their own, but we also get to come back to, I think, like a moment that feels really grounded in like a Bed-Stuy apartment.
It's great. I think that also, I mean, for those of you who might not have realized, I mean, Minneapolis appears in this book.
Yes, it does.
Which is, I was like, oh, there we go, fun.
I love
so
it.
it's nice to see that familiar setting with these wonderful characters. So as we've discussed, you did your MFA here. For any emerging writers in the audience who might be interested, curious about what that experience was like for you.
If I say anything really about my advisor, she's here, folks.
Well, I mean, it's like, right, it's a complex, like they really are not, they're wonderful institutions, and also they work very differently from each other. They're not for everyone. They are wonderfully supportive of some writers. They create structure and also require you to learn how to make your own. Now you're not in one. What did you take forward?
Yeah. So I really loved my time at Minnesota, and I can say that without being like, you know, I'm not being blackmailed into a corner, I promise.
For a small stipend.
I had, I think, the luxury of being able to find readers that were exactly who I would want to learn from, and who I would exactly also want to have the gift of, you know, like being in community with. And I think that was incredible, me making pointed eye contact. But I think that like that was one of those things where I needed to leave my job. I was not going to write a full-length book while I was working like 60 hours a week. That just like wasn't going to happen for me. And I tried, like, you know, I had like a Google Doc open while I was at work trying to write short stories and essays, and that was manageable-ish, you know, but it wasn't long-term sustainable. And so I knew that if I wanted to ever write a full length, that I needed to have the time to do it. And I think from that experience also, I think community, for me, it was also, the pandemic happened or started during my second semester at the U. And there is nothing quite like being trapped in your home in the winter and being unable to leave, but not knowing enough other people to like, and also not having a therapist at the time to like really make you work on your book. And so like I say that and like it kind of like, to me it's like kind of funny in retrospect, but that's nuts. Like that was like the world in which I was like drafting. And so it was like I was spending all of my time drafting. So I think the things that I have taken away from that are more just like I love that setup. Plus the therapist. You're like, oh no. You're like, oh, you're not okay. But I think it's like, yeah, like it's like nice to have a setting where I'm like, oh yeah, like I have the time. The luxury of time was, I think, the gift of the MFA, and it was like the luxury of funded time. So I did not have to worry about paying DC rent, which is what I was doing before. And so all of that, and then having readers and like having people who are as invested in each other, being able to do that for each other, and like, you know, more than just a transaction. And then being able to now, you know, I have the luxury of living in the same city as folks I went to school with, and knowing that they are the first call when I'm ready for pages to be read. And so I think that that's also something that I got to take away from it, is just be like, hey, let me drop this on your doorstep. You can't say no. We see each other too often. Which is a great way to get people to read your work.
That's great. So, I mean, you did so much work to read this, and you mentioned, you know, watching the movies, listening to the songs, reading the books. Of course, here in this wonderful bookstore, you're not limited to purchasing only one book. You could go
So
wild.
many.
Can you recommend any particular books that you found really helpful or any particular films or any resources that people who are interested in more about kind of?
Yeah, I would say that if someone is interested in like reading about partition, that one of the first places to start would be Manto. I think it's start with like the education around, and so Manto also ends up moving to Bombay and becomes like one of the progressive writers in India, and that's like the Marxist writers movement. And so that look back is, I think, incredibly important for folks looking to start in that history. I think primary documents, including like the zines from students, are actually really incredible. And then let me just also say that Zara Chowdhury's memoir just came out on Tuesday. It's called The Lucky Ones. And it is about Zara, it's a memoir about the experience of the 2002 Gujarat pogroms. And it's for me, it is one of the first times that I have gotten to sit with this written by a Gujarati American like diaspora member. And so I just think it's an incredibly important and necessary work, and I would just want to raise that one up. It just came out, so this is get your hands on it fast, yeah.
That's great, thank you so much. I have one question left, but Asha knows what it is, and I wonder if I could turn to you for some questions, because I suspect that there are some brewing in the audience. Anyone? Questions for Asha? Don't be shy.
I have a very trivial question, but I really want to know how you came upon the final title, because I remember you struggling to find a title.
Oh yeah, Julie experienced this firsthand, because I made the mistake of drafting without a title in mind. And then I had the audacity to come to workshop and be like, we're all gonna vote. You guys are gonna make up my titles for me. And then we're all gonna vote on them together, because I had no idea what to do. It ended up being a suggestion by agents, actually. But it also ended up being one that I thought worked really well, because there's this blessing or this song that's like, Tum jiyo hazaro sal ke din ho 50,000, which is may you live for 1,000 years. May every year have 50,000 days, which is like may you live forever, but it's like a happy birthday song. And devastating, how long do you want to live? It's vampiric. But it's like, it's this like old, like it's from the 60s, old song. And I love the idea of like, may you live 1,000 times, also being kind of the idea of that song, and that being, there were also in older drafts like these moments where I think like Amla dreamed of her mom saying that. Those scenes are not in this final version of the novel. But like those lines were in the book, and it was wild because the people who were suggesting this title had never seen it with those lines in it. But the vibe was there, like that's wild. So yeah, so that was kind of where it came from. But I totally A/B tested the other titles from Workshop, yeah.
What other titles?
So one, I think one was just the names of the parts, which are daughter, sister, mother, spirit. But there was a book that came out with a very similar title that year, and then it was also giving Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and so both of those had to be, that had to be waylaid. And then there was All of This Has Happened Before, but I think that was giving a different. I think it was giving like a more contemporary book title than the book that sits before you. Oh yeah, and then there's also a German title, because apparently this is a great gift for talk. There's a song that is like 1,000 times before, but in German, and it's like a pop song from like the 70s. It's like a disco song. And so they had to change the title.
Only in Germany.
Only in Germany to like Amla's Tochter, which is like Amla's daughters. So that's also a different title that the book carries now going forward.
That's amazing.
But the disco song is really fun. And I keep playing it all the time. So there's that.
I'm definitely gonna go home and play that immediately.
I'll send it to you.
So you talked a bit about feeling like that you get to be in a position close to your own, and all of these kind of various rules that you ended up setting for yourself or for the book with respect to authenticity. And I'm curious, what of those rules are you carrying with you to other projects, and what rules do you feel like, oh, this is a rule for this book, but it's not a rule for all books, if that's a distinction you thought through?
Yeah. So I think the speculative object rules, it's wild that when I started writing this, I I too wasn't clear on my rules until a little deeper in the process. And so I think that like that practice of setting rules for my speculative element is important. I think that is like just as a practice, I think that I would carry forward. But I think also I'm interested in the way that like people in my positionality have allowed history to happen the way that it has happened. And so I don't know if that's actually so much of a rule as like a desire to explore, like the role of Hindu fascism in Gujarati community. Like that is like, you know, I'm interested in exploring that. And so I wonder how much of that is a rule for me, but I'm interested in exploring it from my positionality because that is like those are the people who call me one of theirs, right? And so in a way like that I think is like interesting to toy with or like to come from and to explore from there, but I'm not entirely sure that I would see it as I'm almost hesitant to say the word rule because it's a personal preference. And I just think that sometimes rules are just like people writing about things that they don't even know. So like, don't write about things you don't know, you know, it's crazy. You know what I mean?
Congratulations, that's exciting. My question is, how difficult was it to map out this book structurally? And what was the process like for you in terms of figuring out scenes, events, emotional beats, revelation? How did that come alive and when did you figure it out?
Yeah, I think I loved the idea of like, I love a rule of three. And so I was like interested if I was gonna do it as a historical project to like sit in 3 different time periods. And I knew that I needed to get past 2002 for the contemporary because that is the time period that I have lived through. Like I was 7 years old when the pogroms happened. That was like an important part of like my understanding of Gujarati American identity. And then when I was looking at generations, I was like, okay, well, partition. And then I like low-key lucked out that like there's a major movement that happened in that in between. And so thinking about it as 3, yeah, I was so nervous about getting to the end and my pacing being off that I was like, maybe what I can do is think about it as like a 3-act, just like almost just to take a neutral, like a thing that people had said worked for books, you know what I mean? Like just be like, okay, let me just like try and see what happens there. And then because, and now you're really getting this part of the brain. Like if you think about it as like 3 acts and you want each one to have separate beats or they each have their own 3-act, then you end up at 9, which means your climax could hit around 7 and then you have time. And that was how I thought about it each time. And so like I didn't like outline it, but I like knew what I was leading to, so I knew what I wanted my climax for each section to be. Mostly because I also had to map it to political history. So it had to be true. Like those timelines had to be accurate, and Julie and I sat down. There was like a office hours that we had where I was on a whiteboard. Do you remember this? Because you were like, your timelines are wrong, and I was like, oh my god. And so I had to like sit down and like map the 3-act structure above like a chronology timeline because like my dates were getting confused in my own head, and so that was like a really critical part of it for me. And so when I think I got about like 2/3 of the way through, and then I did not believe that the book had the energy to sustain a third part of equal weight. Because I also as a writer felt that I did not have the energy to sustain like that much tension and honestly like turmoil. Like it was like personally hard. I was like, I don't actually think that like this book needs that 3rd section, and that's how Ayukta became the like envelope that houses the rest of everything. And so that way, instead of it being like, you know, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, it became like 1/3, 1/3, and then the rest actually is like interspersed throughout, almost as like a type of relief. And so from like a writing perspective, I think it was like where I got in my own process, I was like, I cannot do this for 9 more chapters again. And then also that whole time I was like discovering the narrator that I wanted her to be, and she was more interesting when she had time earlier. Like to me, she was more interesting that way. Is that helpful? Does that feel right? Yeah, does that, yeah.
Cool. I want to piggyback a question onto Kay's, which is to say that there's like a major storyline that I love, which we haven't really talked about at all. And the book is, it has this queer protagonist and is like a queer love story, and it also is about queer ancestors and history. And like it has at its heart like a beautiful love story, which also at the beginning of the book poses a certain question. And one of the ways that the book pushes forward through the structure that you just described is by letting us see the answer to that question gradually unfold. Is like, that is like very suspenseful. I mean, it is very juicy, folks. When you buy this book shortly and read it, this is one of the things that will have you turning pages. I mean, it was one of the things that had me turning pages when this book was in draft. That, right, like in that history, you have embedded in the characters' storylines. Like this is part of what's going on. Can you talk about how that relates to his question?
Yeah. So the driving question that Ayuk the poster, or that Ayuk and Nadia have had as a couple is whether or not they're going to have children. And so that is the central moment that like I don't think it's a spoiler if it happens in the first 5 pages, you know what I mean? Like it's but it's like Ayuk is having this moment of saying we haven't like, in fact, by not telling you everything that is going to happen, or that everything that has happened in this history, like, we've gotten to a point where we just don't even talk about this anymore. And so this is her way of, like, putting that conversation back up on the table. And for me, I think it was also interesting because we follow these discrete characters across these moments in history. Discrete characters, discrete moments in history. And then there's also the question of, like, how do you decide in, like, any space-time whether or not you are ready to have a child? Like, no matter what is in front of you, like, how do you make that decision? And, like, how do you then also make the decision of what you give them? And I think there was something to me that was interesting about, like, I don't know queer ancestors. Like, I know queer peers in my family, but generationally, but I don't know folks who are older, and I think I ached to know folks who are older. Like, I think that would have been really nice to know as, like, a queer kid in, you know, growing up in the diaspora, and it would have been really nice to have. And I think it almost like gave me the chance to connect this person's story to, you know, that fictionalized story and being able to have that. And so when she re-enters, she's giving checks on even this thing happened and they still saw hope, or even this thing happened and they still decided XYZ. Like, I think it's like generational trauma, generational healing, generational whatever. And then it's also actually hope is just like the other side of that. Like, I'm not saying that has to be kids. I'm just saying that, like, it doesn't have to sit alone. And, like, I think that was what I was interested in exploring with those interspersed scenes of Ayukta and Nadia.
Thank you. Other questions for Asha? Doug?
So, one of the things that I remember you were a central part of a conversation that many of the students and myself were having around this kind of concept of appropriation. I don't know if you remember this. And, like, of course I was like, oh yes. But you're like, no, what happens if you appropriate yourself? Right? And so I'm kind of curious, was that linked to the ancestral memory? How did that resolve? Is that something that writing this book, not even drafting this book, helped you work through? Is it still a book question?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So it's also interesting because there's a character in the book, there are multiple characters in the book who have a particular type of tattoo. It's called Thrujva, and it is linked to Adivasi folks from the Rabari tribe in western Gujarat. And my grandmother had those tattoos. I grew up with her having them all up her arms and up her neck and chin. But one of the big discussions we were having was how much of this history do I get to have, or rather, and me asking this question to myself, how much of it do I get to have, right? If I didn't grow up with her, or when she chose to present a different way in order to make her life easier, and when, you know, it also like skewed the linguistics of my family. Like, my mother thought that the word Thrujva meant only tattoos generally, and that's not true, right? Like, that, but her mother taught her that, and then that gets passed down. So this is the way that it like became this like almost like homogenizing, or rather like ascribing to the dominant identity, or like the identity of best survival, you know, chances for my grandmother, and that was a part of that history. And I think it was interesting because when I gave characters this in the book, right? It's like on the cover, right? Like, it's like these geometric designs on the cover are also Thrujva, and so I think it was like one of those moments where I think I had to decide that, and kind of thinking about, Tim, your question too, which is like, or even just that thought of like, do you know it enough and do you love it enough? And for me it was like, okay, how can I give it like the role in the book that I like want and care for it to have, without making it say a hinge, or without making it say like this big thing for others. Like for me, I wanted to see it on the page, like the book is dedicated to like my maternal grandparents, like I wanted to see it on the page, but I didn't want it to be like the reason for something. And I think that was important to me. I think that was where I landed on it. And then I think it's also that question of like, I think it's also just like knowing that like writing a book like this one as like a debut has like market implication, which was like not a thing that I would have thought about while I was doing it, because it was also not the book that I thought I was going to work on during my MFA. And then also recognizing that it is one that like bleeds my history, and that's not necessarily like, it's not an like it's not autofiction, like it's just that it like I came from that place first as a jumping off point for my research, but for me it bled my history, like it made me mine it. And I think that is something that I will continue to sit with. Like I actually don't think that it is something, you know, I like don't know how to hold that, and I think that is going to be something that I continue to like question, or like turn and like question for everything after it, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Any last questions for Asha? I will close by asking you what you are working on now.
Deep sleep.
I support that.
Rest and relaxation. I am working on spending the summer visiting places I love and getting to see my friends and the places that I love. And then, I'm also like collaborating with friends who are visual, like both artists visually and then also writers, on a fun zine collab, which is my fun current project.
That sounds fabulous.
Yeah, I get to have the benefit of being started, like one of the friends who took the author photo, another friend who's my first reader, we get to just be working on a zine project together, and I think that is honestly, it gives me life, so that's where I'm at right now.
Awesome. Well, we will look forward to reading it. In the meantime, don't miss 1,000 Times Before, and Annie, I don't know if I'm getting the whole spiel, but so Asha will sign books at the table. That is, when you go down to the left, you will see a giant stack of 1,000 Times Before, and that's how you'll know that
1,000 books of 1,000 times.
That's how you'll know. And yeah, we'll see you over there. And thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's so lovely to see all of you.